Louisiana. She's the exception and never the rule. She's a mystery that asks not to be solved, but simply to be experienced. Louisiana, where you can come as you are and leave different. Additional funding is provided by the Friends of Louisiana Public Broadcasting and the Foundation for Excellence.
Ethnic cleansing, the ancestors of the Cajun people were scattered around the world. They were able to end their exile and reunite their families here in Louisiana. People would have been brought down to this area, and this dry creek would have contained water, and they were loaded into the boats and brought down to the Minas Basin, where they had been loaded on the transports and taken away from their homeland forever. European settlers came to this place over 400 years ago. It's amongst the most fertile and beautiful farmland in all of North America. Today it's called Nova Scotia. But to the original French settlers, this place was called L'Acadie. In 1604, 16 years before the Mayflower Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, French colonists came to Acadie and established one of the first permanent European communities in North America. Acadie's early years were precarious, but beginning in 1632, the first families began to arrive at the Port Royal settlement. Over the next 20 years, some 60 families came to make Acadie their home. These were the ancestors of nearly all the Acadian peoples of Canada and Louisiana today.
These people already knew each other. Somewhere around 60% or so of the people who became the Acadians came from the same neighborhood, from around a 20-mile radius around one little town in northern Poitou. They already knew each other. They already had a sense of identity, a sense of community, a sense of society. And essentially, this little society was uplifted and boated over to what we now call Nova Scotia, what they called L'Acadie, after the name that the Micmac Indians used to call the place.
The colony grew rapidly, spreading outward from Port Royal to Grand Pré, the Minas Basin, Beaubassin, and Chignecto. Small families expanded into large clans. These clans formed the base of Acadian society.
The family was so important for those people that there couldn't be a country, there couldn't be a people if there was not basically the groups of families that were all related to one another. So they kept on helping each other to survive. For instance, if one man named Cormier would die, then the Leblanc would take over the kids, but keep the name Cormier so that the descendant of that man would know where they came from.
From the early start of the 17th century, when Acadia appears on the map as a small French colony, the French inhabitants that later on would be known as Acadians really had no choice but to take care of their own affairs. France was far away. The major French settlement in the area was also far away in the St. Lawrence Valley, which is now Quebec.
The Acadians, or at least the colonists, French colonists who colonized the Bay of Fundy Basin were refugees from the very bloody, very intense religious civil war that plagued France for almost a century, from the early to mid 1500s up until and culminating in 1628 with the fall of La Rochelle. Much of the warfare, much of the worst fighting took place in northwestern Poitou province. And the Acadians, who were peasants in that area, were caught in a military crossfire.
As generations passed, memories of the mother country began to fade. Isolated from France, the Acadians began to think of themselves as an independent people, evolving a culture and a way of life uniquely their own, developing a distinctly North American mentality.
The Acadians were the first group of European settlers in the New World to use a name for themselves that no longer had anything to do with the Old World. They were profoundly North American. They were what my colleague Mate Alain refers to as Homo Americanus, the first example, in fact, of that new species.
Work was done as a community, whether it was building their homes, harvesting crops, even holding back the encroaching sea. Through an elaborate system of dikes and sluices, les aboiteaux, the Acadians reclaimed over 13,000 acres of saltwater marsh and turned it into the richest farmland in America.
French Acadia was mostly in what is now Nova Scotia, around the Bay of Fundy. There is where you would have found the great majority of Acadian villages. And the great majority of the inhabitants of those villages were farmers, and they put together sort of a very original way to share cropland by building dikes, sort of to take from the sea a special kind of harvest. And in French, they would call these systems aboiteaux. This made them very prosperous farmers that had to work together, because at low tide they could work in the fields, but if the tides, especially the tides of the Bay and Fundy, which are one of the highest in the world, when the big tides would come in, they would have to fight the tides away by building these dikes.
But it was not just the sea that was threatening Acadie. The Acadians had built a prosperous, independent homeland. Fish and game were abundant, their orchards were bountiful, trade with their neighbors was lucrative. Epidemics like smallpox, typhoid, and cholera were unknown in Acadie. They lived as well or better than anyone else in North America. But what the Acadians had, others would soon try to take away.
This is the minus basin.
Less than 10 years into the colony's existence, Fort Royal was burned to the ground by English forces from Virginia. This was only the beginning. The French and British were trading pawns in a deadly game for the possession of North America, with Acadie as the key strategic prize. The colony had changed hands 10 times in the first 100 years of its history before finally being ceded to the British in 1713. It was an uneasy peace, the French ready to retake Acadie, or Nova Scotia as the British called it. The Acadians, however, did not care about the color of the flag that floated over the governor's house.
The Acadians had learned over the years that for a while they might belong to France, and for a while they might belong to England, and then they would return to France, and then they would return to England. They had learned by that experience to not place a whole lot of stock in who owned the colony at any given moment. While they belonged to, during the periods they belonged to England, they didn't stop trading with New France, and during the periods that they belonged to France, they didn't stop trading with New England.
When the British took control of Nova Scotia, many of them wanted to get rid of the Acadians altogether, but they couldn't. Not just yet, anyway.
The British weren't able to expel the Acadians in 1713 simply because they were dependent upon the Acadians for their source of supply. Acadia was a backwater outpost outside of the main shipping lanes which went to Boston and Quebec. And as a consequence, the cost of maintaining a garrison from either Boston or London would have been extremely high.
So by threats and empty promises, the British spent the next several decades trying to assimilate the Acadians. Each successive governor of Nova Scotia would try to force the Acadians to swear the oath of allegiance to the British crown unconditionally, and always they would refuse.
They learned to be very independent, fiercely independent, and to sort of disregard institutional authority from afar.
Throughout their negotiations with the British, the Acadians insisted on 3 fundamental conditions: the unrestricted right to practice their Catholic religion, full ownership of their land and property, and the exemption from having to bear arms.
They weren't as reluctant to simply pledge allegiance to the British, but they were reluctant to accept all of the factors that came along with that. One of them was that they were going to have to stop speaking French and learn English. Another was that they were likely going to have to change religions. And the most important one, the Acadians, if they were anything, they were profoundly pragmatic. The most important one was that if they became English subjects, they would have to accept to fight against the enemies of the British, which meant that they were going to have to fight against the Micmac Indians who had helped them establish themselves there and with whom they had wonderful relations. And they were going to have to accept to fight against the French.
Attempts to assimilate the Acadians had failed, and the military situation was growing increasingly tense as England and France prepared for yet another war. The neutral Acadians found themselves living between 2 heavily armed and hostile camps.
It's essentially a flashpoint. It's one of those areas where the 2 empires come into direct contact, and it's also where military force is brought to bear right on the common boundary line. And it's as a result of this that the area's importance is magnified, especially where the Acadian population is concerned.
It's important to understand when considering this business of the oath of allegiance that people often ask, why did the Acadians not sign the oath of allegiance? Why they didn't accept it? Well, the British governors were being very careful for a long time, and it's documented that they didn't want the Acadians to take that oath of allegiance. They didn't want to deal with that because they didn't want, they were trying to hold off and stave off enough time and not press this issue so that they didn't get the Acadians, getting a bunch of Acadians jumping across the line and going to help the French before the English were well enough established to be able to resist that kind of attack. And it wasn't until Lawrence got there that they finally felt like they had the numbers to protect the colony, and that's when they started to press it. But even then, Lawrence said in several letters, you know, I will present to them one last time the oath of allegiance, and they will not sign this, but I will use as a pretext that they had refused it before to not let them sign it. And if they don't sign it, I shall deport them. And if they should figure out a way to accept the terms and sign it, I will deport them anyway. No matter what they did, whether they accepted or not, the plan had already been set into motion to rid the colony of these people.
His solution was nothing less than a complete ethnic cleansing of the country.
Thomas.
In a plan masterminded by Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts, infamous in his hatred for the French, Lawrence took command of 2,000 volunteer soldiers. They confiscated the Acadians' firearms and their boats, effectively neutralizing them as a military force. Still, the Acadians refused to sign the unconditional oath. On September 5th, 1755, the men of Grand Pré were ordered to report to their church for negotiations. It was a trap. Once inside, the men and boys were taken prisoner. The soldiers announced that the Acadians would forfeit their lands to the British Crown and be deported. For days, their wives and children waited at home. Some would never see their families again. This was the beginning of Le Grand Dérangement. Before it was over, Acadie would be destroyed. Many Acadians fled into hiding, and over 6,000 of them would be transported by force and scattered throughout the British North American colonies.
The British found themselves in the untenable position of being in political control of a colony they didn't actually own. The Acadians had been there for about 100 years, and they had not settled the worst lands. They were on the best lands. And British families that were coming in to settle the colony were having to go out and clear the woods and the rocks. And that wasn't acceptable to the British government. So what they did very simply was basically boat lift everybody off those lands so that they could put good British subjects on them.
Things are now very heavy on my heart and hands. It hurts me to hear their weeping. I'm in hopes our affairs will soon put on another face, and I rid of the worst piece of service yet ever I was in. John Winslow.
You will use all the means proper and necessary for collecting the people together so as to get them on board. If you find that fair means will not do with them, you must proceed by the most vigorous measures possible, not only in compelling them to embark, but in depriving those who shall escape of all means of shelter or support, by burning their houses and destroying everything that may afford them the means of subsistence in the country. By order, Major Charles Lawrence.
It's not every Acadian that passively resisted the deportation and accepted it with quiet resignation as the stereotype has often been presented. There were some, they were a minority yet, but there were nevertheless some for whom this exercise was completely unbearable, and they preferred taking refuge in the woods, living with the native people of the area, and actively resisting all the incursions that the British soldiers would later inflict upon them. It was under the leadership of a Joseph Brossard that was nicknamed Beau Soleil.
Brossard du Beau Soleil was a very hard-headed and stubborn Acadian. We know this of him because he was implicated in a few trials during the British regime in Nova Scotia. He spent many years with Mi'kmaq warriors attacking some British garrison. He was protected by well-connected Acadian uncles and cousins who dealt sort of on a daily basis with the British officials, but they never trusted Beau Soleil. Beau Soleil was known to have fights with Acadian men. He was accused of being the father of a child out of wedlock.
Beau Soleil Brossard was the leader of the Acadian resistance, but in the end, facing the imminent starvation of his family, even he was obliged to lay down his arms and surrender. Beau Soleil spent the remainder of the war a prisoner of the British. Locked in the cargo holds of the prison ships, there was no sanitation, no sunlight, not even room to move. Many of the exiles would die of hunger and disease before they ever saw land. The Acadians were scattered throughout the American colonies, from Massachusetts to Georgia. But wherever they went, it was always the same. They were unwelcome aliens, hated for their French language, their Catholic faith, and their refusal to be absorbed by the Anglo-American culture.
Quand les Acadiens ont été déportés, l'idée de Charles Lawrence, c'était de disperser ces gens-là en petites poches de société pour qu'il y ait plus un peuple qui s'appelle Acadien ou qui se considère Acadien, mais ils avaient mal compris la profondeur de ce sens d'identité qui avait commencé à cause du fait que c'était des gens qui se connaissaient déjà avant de partir, même de la France. Donc, quand ils ont essayé de les disperser pour briser la société, rendu là, en 1755, c'était impossible. Le sens d'identité était déjà trop fort.
Nearly 1,000 exiles were sent to Maryland. Within a few years, their number had dwindled by as much as a third. Their kinsmen in Virginia faced even greater trials.
These exiles contracted smallpox, one of the two great scourges of the 18th century, a disease they hadn't encountered in predispersal Acadia. As a consequence, when they arrived in Virginia, the colonial government refused to allow them to debark. They remained aboard the ship in quarantine, and the disease just decimated the ranks of the exiles. It was eventually decided by the government that they should be shipped elsewhere because they would never be given entry because of the epidemic. So the ships were ordered to sail for England, and during the passage, two of the ships sank. The survivors made their way to England at British seaports where they were placed in detention centers. Those who did survive were sent by the British to French seaports in 1763.
During the exile, the dislocation and loss of life was so great that the Acadian population of both the Canadian Maritimes and Louisiana combined is but a small fraction of the 7 million demographers estimate it would be today had the Grand Dérangement, the deportation, never occurred.
The Acadians had a remarkable communications network during the exile. At the height of the dispersal, there were Acadians living in France, there were Acadians in the Falkland Islands, Acadians in northern coast of South America and the West Indies, scattered along the eastern seaboard, in Quebec. The fact of the matter, though, was that the Acadians were able to communicate with one another. Each of these communities managed somehow to communicate with relatives elsewhere in the world.
Acadians began arriving in Louisiana from the British colonies, especially Maryland and Pennsylvania. Nearly a generation later, the largest group, the Acadian exiles in France, immigrated as a community. The Spanish government in Louisiana provided each Acadian family with land, tools, seeds to plant, and a musket. The settlers began building farms and cattle ranches, and within a few years they had achieved a quality of life comparable to the one that they had left behind in Acadienne. Beausoleil Broussard had led his people to this fertile grassland in the spring of 1765. That autumn, he was laid to rest. But he had lived to witness the founding of a new settlement, a new homeland, and the birth of a new Acadie. The Acadians had to adapt to the subtropical climate of Louisiana. It changed the food they ate, the crops that they grew, the way they built their houses, and even the clothes they wore. But in many ways, Nouvelle Acadie was not unlike the old.
The people who became the Acadians when they came from France, they didn't forget everything they knew. And they didn't forget, the way they lived when they crossed the Atlantic, just as they didn't forget what they had developed when they came down to Louisiana after the exile. They had a way of building houses, they had a way of cooking, they had a way of, they had songs they sang, they carried in their collective memories, stories they told.
The women were so important that they were really the link between the ancestors and the future generation. They had to give to the people that were going to come out of that group. They were just a tiny group at the beginning. And now today we're a people. Where did we get all what we know, our memory? We got it from the transmission given by the women. They would teach the children also how to be French in an English colony, how to remain something that had been great one day, and they were coming here in America, transplanting an ancient culture to a new world.
When Acadian women married non-Acadian men, they acculturated them into their own French-speaking community. The children of these outsiders became French-speaking Acadians. This was especially true after the Civil War. But rather than diluting Acadian identity, this served to enrich and to diversify it. And that's why today we have Cajuns with family names like Romero, Shake Snyder, Huffpower, Reed, and McGee.
When the Acadians arrived, all of the exiles arrived with virtually nothing. But over the following century, you see the accumulation of wealth in the hands of certain families. And these families, by the time of the Civil War, are some of the most wealthy families in South Louisiana. The vast majority of Acadians, however, remained petits habitants, or essentially yeoman farmers, pursuing a way of life that had changed little from the time of their forefathers. So you see two polar extremes developing in the Acadian community, two distinct communities emerging by the time of the Civil War.
Il y avait des Acadiens qui avaient monté l'échelle sociale, arrivés jusqu'à la guerre de sécession. Et il y avait des plantations, et pour eux, la guerre voulait dire quelque chose. Mais la plupart des Cajuns, les petits habitants, ils n'avaient rien à voir. Il n'y avait pas d'esclaves et ils travaillaient leur petite terre eux-mêmes, et s'ils n'étaient pas là, le travail n'était pas fait. Ça fait pour eux, la guerre voulait absolument rien dire. C'était un embarras. The Civil War was a major turning point for French Creole society. They saw in the Civil War the possibility that they might be able to preserve their specificity, their Frenchness, their French culture and language, which they had valiantly tried to preserve through several rewrites of the Constitution, several renegotiations of a place for themselves in what came to be called Louisiana. With the end of the Civil War, and with the elimination of the possibility of seceding, they finally got the message, and they were not going to, they understood that they were not going to be able to escape becoming part of the United States of America and all that implied. And the language of the future was English, and the economy of the future was American, and they began to make the transition right after the Civil War. They began to send their children to English language schools, and they began to participate in the economy in a way that they had not done before. And the Cajuns, on the other hand, just very simply didn't get the message. They weren't plugged into the same economic and political and social systems.
A century before, Acadians had resisted giving their allegiance to imperial powers and refused to bear arms in their wars. Much like their ancestors, the petits habitants considered themselves French neutrals and took no interest in la guerre des confédérés, the Confederate War. But the South needed soldiers desperately and began conscripting Acadian farmers in great numbers.
Quand ça arrivait pour les mettre dans l'armée, il fallait les conscrire. Il fallait les forcer de rentrer dans l'armée. Et même là, arriver dans l'armée, s'ils n'étaient pas assez loin pour les empêcher de rentrer à pied, ils partaient et puis rentraient chez eux. Et il y avait tout un système qu'on avait développé, surtout dans les mèches et dans les bois, pour les cacher. Il fallait qu'ils se cachent non seulement des Yankees du Nord, mais aussi du Sud qui essayaient de les retrouver pour les remettre dans l'armée. Alors ils avaient besoin de les cacher des deux bords.
When the Union Army invaded southwest Louisiana, some Acadians greeted them as liberators. But they soon came to detest these troops as much as they did the Confederates. Union forces swept through their homeland, taking the Acadians' food, their horses, and as many as 10,000 head of cattle. Caught in the middle of a war between two American armies, Nouvelle-Acadie was virtually destroyed. The Acadians had come to Louisiana nearly a half-century before it became part of the United States, remaining almost a nation unto themselves. But with the Civil War, America had come to them, and a great wave of cultural change was rolling toward Nouvelle-Acadie.
The aftermath of the Civil War was really a very difficult time for the Acadian population. There was tremendous devastation wrought by the war. The Confederate Army used the area as a foraging area. The Union Army used the area as a foraging area. Both sides attempted to take food stocks and other goods out of the area, and the result was widespread devastation. As a result of the devastation and a series of years in which there was unseasonable weather, natural disasters, including floods on the scale of the 1927 flood, and labor problems, many farmers in the area were reduced from the status of freeholders to tenant farmers.
The great majority of Acadians living in Louisiana were uneducated, poor, and alienated from an increasingly modern, increasingly Americanized society. These Cajuns, as they were called, became an object of ridicule to the rest of the country.
Dans la plupart des commentaires, aussi bien par les politiciens que par les journalistes, que par tous les gens qui ont observé les Cajuns, systématiquement, ils trouvaient que les Cajuns étaient paresseux et sans ambition. Et c'est intéressant de considérer pourquoi ils pensaient ça, parce que les Américains avaient comme une notion de l'économie qui était basée sur la progression, sur l'acquisition de beaucoup d'argent et de propriétés, alors que la grande partie des Cajuns, c'était simplement des gens qui étaient tout à fait heureux de faire leur petite ferme donner à manger à leur famille, juste avoir assez pour faire la vie.
The Cajuns were viewed as little different from the destitute immigrants arriving in America at that time, even though their families had been in Louisiana since well before the American Revolution. Much like the British over a century before, the Anglo-Americans felt that the best way to deal with the Cajuns was to eliminate their culture and to assimilate them.
All over the world, there was this fierce nationalism that was causing countries to regularize language teaching and regularize social and cultural behavior. In America, you had Teddy Roosevelt saying, you know, there is room for but one language in this country, and that is the English language. For we must assure that the crucible turns out Americans and not some random dwellers in a polyglot boarding house. He was also saying things like, there's no such thing as a hyphenated American. There's no such thing as a French American or a German American or a Spanish American. He said, if you feel French or German or Spanish, go home. You know, we have something new happening here. And this nationalist movement led to the well-known story in Louisiana of outlawing French in the schools at the same time as free, mandatory public education was made available for the first time in the history of the Acadians. So for the first time in their history, they find themselves obliged to go to school, and in the same motion, forbidden to speak French in those schools.
The most profound change in Acadian society in the early 20th century was the result of the compulsory education law of 1916. Cajun children were ridiculed and beaten in schools in a systematic effort to eradicate their language. An entire generation of Cajuns was taught to believe that their French-speaking culture made them inferior to other Americans.
These kids were being told at school that the language they learned at home was not only useless, it was a social problem. It was a stigma.
J'ai été né à parler français. J'ai appris l'anglais quand j'étais à l'école. Je me rappelle comment m'a essayé de me commencer à me montrer de certaines paroles en anglais que fallait je connais quand j'ai commencé l'école. Pour moi, c'était assez dur. Je n'aurais jamais pu apprendre ça. J'ai dit, maman, je ne pourrais jamais apprendre ça. C'est trop dur pour moi. Et on ne pouvait pas parler français naturellement sur la cour d'école si le principal les attrapait. Mais on se cachait, on parlait en français en disant, tu comprends, si on voyait les maîtresses venir ou le principal, ouais, naturellement, on se taisait.
C'est mon père parlait seulement en français, ma mère parlait seulement en français. Le 20 vieux oncles qui avaient venu rester avec nous autres, on parlait seulement en français. Tous les voisins, tous les petits amis, quand on venait de l'école, on parlait en français. On parlait en français dessus la cour de l'école quand ça ne nous attrapait pas.
Ouais, si ça nous attrapait, après parler français, on était baptuchés. Le premier. La première fois, ça nous attrapait. Plus ou moins, on était punis. Des fois, on avait des lignes à écrire, qu'on n'aurait pas parlé français sur la table d'école, des affaires comme ça. Mais là, si tu étais attrapé encore, là, des fois, tu étais bûché.
The Cajuns were not alone in the struggle to preserve their language and heritage. Their cultural counterparts, the black Creoles of Louisiana, shared the same experience.
Je sais qu'avec mon père et avec mes grands-parents, avec mes tantes et mes oncles surtout, ils étaient élevés à l'époque où il y avait beaucoup de pression, surtout, je crois, sur le monde de couleur, qu'il fallait que tout le monde parle anglais, que tout le monde devenir comme les Américains.
The arrival of the railroad revolutionized travel in South Louisiana. Before the arrival of the railroad, everything was based on water communications, primarily with New Orleans. Before the arrival of the railroad, the Prairie region had been a real backwater. The arrival of the railroad brought the late 19th century directly to the Cajun prairies. The population within a 10-mile radius of the railroad was directly affected. Many pockets of traditional culture, however, remained in the area. This was a direct result of social isolation, which in fact was a form of resistance against modernization.
But if American influences were trickling into Cajun society, nothing prepared it for the flood of change that would come with the discovery of oil.
Oil provided the strongest catalyst for change, the strongest economic incentive, because a farmer could make more in one day as a roughneck in the oil industry, working in the Bosco fields, than he could working in a month as a day laborer in the area. It provided tremendous economic incentive for change. And the oil industry was dominated by Anglo immigrants, primarily from Oklahoma and Texas. Advancement in the oil industry was predicated upon one's ability to function in that English language culture. And this provides a strong economic incentive for people to move into the Anglo-American mainstream.
During World War I, during this nationalistic period with the exclusion of the French language on school grounds, punishing kids, humiliating kids, forcing them into a position where the first few weeks of school they had to wet their pants every day because they didn't know how to ask for permission to go to the bathroom in English, and they weren't allowed to ask in French. And a language that causes you to humiliate yourself in that way, causes you to be punished, write 1,000 times, I will not speak French on the school grounds, wear a sign that, you know, calling attention to yourself as a fool. You want to distance yourself from that language as fast as possible. But then the same generation finds themselves fighting World War II. And many of them found themselves in the European theater in France. And it occurred to me that many of them that this language that they were told wasn't even real French and it was worthless worked just fine. Especially when talking to French peasants and ordinary people in the marketplace and trying to get a date with this pretty girl or get a bottle of wine or a dry place to sleep. And their superiors noticed this right away. You know, these people can speak to the natives. And so they became interpreters.
World War II had a huge impact on Cajun society, and I'd say it's one of the three most important events in the entire sweep of Acadian history from 1604 to the present. First of all, you had all Cajun males from the ages of 18 to 36 being susceptible to the draft, so they were being picked up by Uncle Sam and being sent to camps and God knows where for basic training, and there no one spoke French. They were expected to speak English. Maybe some of these guys had never been away from their hometowns before or past the parish line. So all of a sudden they're immersed in this English-speaking world, and they had to learn to speak English in order to stay alive.
These GIs who came back home after World War II, they were the ones who were populating the bars and the dance halls, trying to dance and drink and forget their troubles. What they wanted was to hear traditional Cajun music, and they wanted to be home, and they wanted to have their traditional... And they're the ones who said, you know what? This language they told us wasn't real French works. And they began to reconsider the whole thing. In fact, if there was a nationalistic movement associated with World War I, there was a sort of a regional movement associated with the end of World War II. This is when the Newport Folk Festival was developed. There was a celebration, a search for diversity in America. We became, as a country, afraid of all looking alike and sounding alike and being alike. And so we began to explore our own diversity. In that exploration, in the 50s and 60s, the Cajuns played a major part. The Cajuns were invited to the 1964 Newport Folk Festival. Dewey Balfour and Gladys Thibodeau and Vinus Lejeune went up there. And the feeling here was that they were going up there to get laughed at. But when they got up there, they were considered instead heroes of cultural preservation as early as the late 40s, in fact, even before the Newport Folk Festival. You had people like Ira Lejeune, Lawrence Walker, Aldous Roger, Austin Peete, Dewey Balfour, people like that leading a reconsideration of what was valuable in the culture and by association in the language.
While the musicians waged a war of resistance on stage, others were taking up the fight on other fronts. Politician and activist Jimmy DeMongeau founded the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana, Codeville, with a radical new mission now written into state law.
The Council for the Development of French in Louisiana had a very, in the early going, had a very elitist approach to things. It was saving French from the top down with schools and with, you know, social clubs and that kind of thing. Whereas there was a grassroots surge that was looking to happen. And it happened under the leadership of musicians. It was in 1974 that we put together the first Cajun Music Festival. It was the first expression of grassroots support, this surge of cultural, social power that came up from the bottom and said, you know, we are concerned about this. We're interested in this. This is important to us. And it was celebrated with music. And it continued to be celebrated with music through things like festivals and Dewey Balfour's Folk Artists in the Schools program. And eventually, Codeville married the two. Jimmy DeMango, the president of Codeville, was very perceptive. He noticed that language doesn't exist in a vacuum. You can't just preserve French. You have to preserve something to do in French. French has to make you laugh and dance and cry, and it has to be part of your life. So this cultural movement emerged alongside this linguistic educational movement.
French immersion in Louisiana is based on the Canadian model. The Canadians have been doing French immersion since the 60s, when Anglophone Canadians realized that their children would be at a disadvantage. They couldn't get federal jobs if they weren't bilingual the way most French-speaking Canadians were. And so it's a matter of economics there. In Louisiana, the movement was spurred by parents of that lost generation, parents whose parents did not speak French to them.
While it's not true that Cajun French is so different from what we call French that it's another language, it also is true that it has its own particularities and its own vocabulary, word choice, syntax style. And it's important, I think, to, as we work to preserve French in Louisiana, that we remember that what we're trying to preserve here is the way people here speak, and the way, because it's this language that produced Cajun music and the stories and you know, the way people think about things. We can't just import university French from France or Belgium or Quebec or anywhere else. I think we have to be very careful to incorporate the way people speak here, and we have to respect that.
Il s'appelle celui qui joue l'accordéon, là. Philippe, oui, c'est pas David, oui. Il est pas à l'entour, tu peux?
Peut-être.
Peut-être, on va aller voir.
Je pense qu'il est au bateau. Il est dans le bateau.
Ah, il est dans le bateau, ok, ouais. On va aller au bateau tout à l'heure, nous autres même. On va faire la chanson peut-être encore une fois. Belle Louisiane, c'est bon pour vous? Allez. Belle Louisiane,
Is it possible to say French in Louisiana? Absolutely.
Est-ce que le livre est sur la table?
Our last and best hope. And that is the immersion program, because it's the only thing that actually teaches the kids, gets the kids to actually speak the language, to live in the language.
Et sous la table?
Non, le livre n'est pas sous la table. Le livre est sur la table.
Très bien.
Yes, it is possible. Damn right it's possible.
I was trying to explain to you in French. Ma grand-mère est morte hier soir. He said, time out. You can take a time out. You can speak English now and tell me what, you know, what
And you
happened.
said no.
The whole reason why I went to St. Anne's was because I wanted to be able to speak French with my grandmother. Big church, just the wind would blow, I could hear it creaking, and I had my dictionary. I mean, I could pray in English, but I had my dictionary trying to pray in French. And I remember thinking, you can pray in English, it's okay, but I didn't. Because if any opportunity to speak French with my grandmother, it's now.
Yeah, because now you knew she could hear you.
Hear me.
That was a remarkable thing to do, and it represented to me. I remember thinking at the time it was really an astonishing decision that you made, because your mother offered you to come home.
I said,
and you said you didn't want to go home.
No, there was no way I could, because I knew that my grandmother wanted me to do this, and I thought if I come home, I wouldn't be finished. You know?
qu'on a payé cette soulier rouge. Elle dit, elle a donné ça à quelqu'un nommé Betty Ann. Et elle m'a dit que Betty Marie, elle était petite comme ça. Et moi, je crois pas. Elle est petite.
After nearly 250 years in Louisiana, Cajun culture is not only surviving, but undergoing a renaissance. What's amazing is not that some of the aspects of the culture have changed or even been lost, but that the Cajun people have been able to overcome exile and resist assimilation and continue to sing their songs, tell their stories, and build their levees against the tide.
Je prie, j'ai ramé, j'écris, contre vent,